You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations about ending things and collective liberation. Sebastian Merrill's debut collection, Ghost Seeds, was selected by Kimiko Hahn as the winner of the 2022 X.J. Kennedy Poetry Prize, published by Texas Review Press in November 2023. Ghost Seeds was recently named a winner of the 2024 Stonewall Honor Book, Barbara Gittings Literature Award from the American Library Association, and was selected by Ellen Doré Watson as the winner of the 2022 Levis Prize for Poetry from Friends of Writers. Sebastian is also a yoga instructor and happens to be a dear friend. In this conversation between me and Sebastian, we use his book as a frame to think about transition, the narratives we carry along and try to break with, relating with our ghosts and our grief, the absurdity of gender, and what liberation even means. Hope you like it. Thank you so much for coming to talk to me today, Sebastian. I'm so excited to talk with you and share it. We just published this book, Ghost Seeds, which is a book-length collection of poetry that has a narrative aspect to it. And it's really got me thinking, which the angle of the podcast is thinking about breaking up and what that brings into our life. And one of the ways that I've thought about breakups, surviving a breakup, and also just sort of grief in general is this process of learning to live with a ghost. And it's in your title, Ghost Seeds, but you specifically in your book are confronting a ghost that you live with, which is, I don't know what you want to call her, like a pre-transition version of yourself, or the ghost girl that's inside of you. You ask the ghost in the book, where and when do we divide? And she says at some point, it's hard to believe the same sun still rises even after we are ripped apart, which to me is like real breakup feels, right? This is the world where we no longer are together. We could get into this, like thinking about the connection between transition and breaking up. Is it a breaking up with the self or a mourning of something? Like, how do you think about this, and how did it come into your decision to write the book?
I conceived of the book because I really did feel haunted by a version of myself that I no longer was, especially in terms of being around people in my life who really struggled with my transition and would refer to me with my former name and my former pronouns, essentially dead naming me and mispronouncing me. And I felt really haunted by that experience because I felt as though I wasn't really being seen by that other person. They were seeing some former version of myself. And I also felt as though there's so much language around transition within the trans community with terms like dead naming that have to do with death and grief and the death of a former self. And I really wanted to kind of interrogate that, think about that, and really wrestle with this idea that there might be a version of myself that I had left behind in order to transition. And in many ways, I think that coming into an understanding of myself as a man, as someone who is trans, did involve like a pretty intense divestment from preconception of who I was supposed to be and how I was supposed to go through the world, and required a lot of introspection and really coming into my own self rather than conforming to the expectations of who I was supposed to be.
Yeah, there's multiple timelines going on, but sticking with that, with like the kind of process of understanding who you are versus the expectations. There's a question in the book, when did you realize you are not me? And I guess that's like a question that people ask trans people very often. Like, when did you know? Did you know who you were? Yeah, right. I mean, one of the things I think they're doing that in the book that's really cool is it's different from liberal, mainstreamy understanding of transness, which is that you are like trapped in the wrong body, that you're always the gender that you transition into, even when you are being, brought up as a different gender. But the book produces a different kind of relationship between the post-transition self and the pre-transition self, that like that pre-transition self persists in some way, maybe not like aging or something, maybe trapped in time, but it's like a voice in the book that she talks, right? You give her a voice. So I wonder, can you talk about that experience of relating to this other self, like that goes against the grain of the narrative that you're supposed to have either been one self the whole time, or like you totally remove that pre-transition self from anything you discuss with other people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons why I don't like the question, especially when it's posited by cis people, of when did you realize you were trans, is because I don't think that that gets at the nuance of identity and the way that our identities are continually in flux and continually in a state of transition and change throughout our lives. And it instead, I think that the question, when did you realize when you were trans, is trying to pinpoint a very specific moment in time. And it's trying to make the idea of transition into something really neat and simple that can be easily understood. And that's something that I've also encountered, within the medical industry around accessing gender affirming care, especially so I came out as trans and started my physical transition in 2011, 2012. And at that time, insurance didn't cover gender affirming care. And there was very much a model of gatekeeping where certain stories had to be told. There were expectations that you had a specific story of your transition, your experience of your body in order to access gender affirming care, in which, very much as you kind of described, this narrative of born in the wrong body, or this idea that you have to hate your current body so much that the only choice that you have is to transition. And I really push against that linearity of narrative and the simplicity that those narratives are expecting, because I think that there's no room for nuance there, that there can be great joy in physical transition. And also there is a loss, right? There's a loss of the body as it was before. There's a loss of the person that you were before. Yeah, I think a lot about pushing against simplistic narratives, and even just the power of adding my specific story, my specific narrative into this growing canon of trans stories just gives one more perspective of what a transition could look like, of what a experience of being trans could look like. And I think that there's real power in our voices being in the world.
Yeah, I love the way that you're talking about it. What you're reflecting on in the way that like a particularly cis people sort of try to pinpoint transness at like a moment of revelation. There is, this stuff that we do on our own, look like scanning through your life, trying to make sense of it. For me, one of the experiences with being like, oh, if I can understand all of these things that happened to me that were like totally inexplicable and rage filled and like whatever, if I like think about that I was living the wrong gender, right, in that moment, and that I was trying to be someone that I or like act as someone I couldn't actually be. So we do that work ourselves, sort of thinking about a revised timeline. But one of the ways that you present it too, because like you're saying at the beginning of your answer, just thinking about transition as a kind of ongoing process, which I love that. Just thinking that transition doesn't have to be this exceptional one-time thing, but there's many different moments and lifelines and temporalities. Like there's not one moment of separation that you're talking about in this book, but like many different moments. I think you're asking the question too, like how many separations can there be, or how many different places breaks happen in a lifetime, right? And in that way, transition then becomes part of a different life process than what it's normally thought of. So yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about these different timelines that you are engaging with in the book. Also, the way that you kind of share that process with other people, right? And like in by going over that, these are a lot of these are like intimate thoughts.
Yeah, I think that the project kind of started as this letter to my ghost. I mean, the original title of the book was To My Ghost. And I started it that way because I knew I wanted to write about trans identity and experience, and I was really struggling with finding an access point for myself to writing into that, especially when I thought about a cis audience and trying to explain gender to someone who's not trans. I just got really stuck. And so it began as this letter to my former self. And at a certain point, it started to feel a little unfair to not give her a voice. I started to get curious of, okay, I'm writing to this former self. Well, what does she have to say? How does she feel about all of this? And so I started writing these poems in her voice through this kind of added layer of this lens of the myth of Persephone. And I think that myth and mythology can be really powerful ways of interrogating and accessing these really big underlying concepts in our lives, such as grief. And also, I very intentionally wanted this girl ghost figure to be somewhere other than our real, quote unquote, real reality of our world. I wanted her to be in some kind of liminal space. And so, in many ways, placing her in the underworld enabled her to be both of this world and not of this world. And I also felt pretty strongly that I didn't want to include my dead name in the book. So the book was inspired in part by a couple of other transmasc poets, including T.C. Tolbert, who has these incredible Dear Melissa poems in which he writes to his former self, and Sam Ace in the introduction to a reprint of his book. When I grab it, okay. Sam Ace is a transmasc poet who, before he transitioned, published and wrote a book called Normal Sex and Home in 3 Days Don't Wash under the name Linda Smuckler. And so Belladonna Press did a reprint of his book with both names on the cover. So his current name, Samuel Ace, and his former name, Linda Smuckler. And in the opening kind of introduction to this reprint, he writes a correspondence between himself and his former self. And there was something so arresting to me about that dialogue. He writes, "Dear friend who is me and no longer me. Dear love who I have never left behind. Dear gorgeous Linda, in all that your name implies, let me say again that I love you." So that unlocked something for me. That was a big inspiration for the book that I ended up writing. And also, I think that I'm in a place in my own gender journey where I don't feel comfortable bringing my dead name onto the page and into that dialogue. And so I ended up using the name Persephone as a kind of stand-in for my former name. And it was a really transformative experience for me to write this book and to give her voice. Sometimes when I was working on the book, especially when I was writing her poems, I would feel really sad. It would bring up a lot of really hard feelings for me. But I also think that one of the really cool things about the trajectory of the book was that I knew, that I was bringing these two voices together. And also, as I was writing it, I didn't know how it was going to end. There's a point in kind of what is now kind of the mid section of the book where there is kind of a deepening sense of ambiguity of what's real and what's not. There's this scene near the beginning of the book where there's the transmasc speaker encounters a dead seal on the beach. And he tells this story about how he kind of helps to bring the dead seal's body back into the sea to kind of float away with the tide. And then later in the book, he kind of undoes that story and says, I didn't do that at all. I walked up onto the island, I smoked a joint, and when I came back, the seal was gone. And so there was this kind of like lack of clarity of what's real and what's not, and what's true and what's not. And that was my original ending of the book, was I ended on this sense of real ambiguity of what's real and what's not. And then at a certain point, I realized that wasn't the full story I wanted to tell, and the story continues. And I think ends with a real sense of coming together of the former self and the girl ghost, and for me, a sense of making peace with the former self, and kind of a beautiful kind of sense of forgiveness and love. And that was an ending that I didn't anticipate when I started writing the book.
I was thinking about that also when you were quoting from the Normal Sex new introduction, the love that he was keeping on the former self, and thinking about how that shows up in your book, the trans masculine speaker version of you in relationship with the ghost girl is not in this moment in a relationship of resistance, right? It's like welcoming in her voice. It's saying we too a lot. Like there's a plural, right? It's not there's an I mean, there's multiple voices in this, and I want to talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that. But yeah, there's like an I that he says, but also a we, so a pairing or a track where they're sharing an experience too. And yeah, I guess like, is there anything that like through the writing of the book, since you said there was a discovery and like a new moment in the writing than what you had expected, like how did that alter your own relationship to this ghost of a former self that wasn't right?
I appreciate that you're noticing the pronouns. It's something that I tracked really carefully throughout the book and used really intentionally. And one of the journeys that I wanted the book to take us on is it starts with this really kind of stark differentiation between the eye of the transmasculine speaker and the eye of the girl ghost. And then as the book continues, we move more from the singular I to the plural we. So there is this kind of within the language itself of the text, a coming together of these two voices, including on the page itself. At a certain point, I have the transmask speaker actually journey into the underworld to meet with his ghosts. And I think that one of the aspects of writing the book that was really liberating for me was letting go of, for myself, trying to adhere to any kind of normative narratives of the self and really giving myself the freedom to be playful on the page, to allow these voices to really come into their own. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that in many ways, the book is very much grounded on my own identity, my own experience, and also at a certain point in the writing, I felt as though even the primary, what I think of as the primary speaker, our trans masculine speaker, he becomes his own kind of version of me too, right? Like he's different than I am. And one of the really beautiful or interesting things about the book for me is that even the voice of that speaker is now different than the voice of who I am today, right? Like my gender, my experience has continued to change and evolve. And so now that book is kind of like an encapsulation of who I was when I was writing it. And one of the reasons why layering in myth and layering in kind of these magical realist elements was so helpful for me was that it allowed it to have that freedom of expression and freedom of really exploring these ideas of the self without it being tied down to quote unquote like a real experience or a memoir. I think that's one of the things that poetry really gives us is this liberation from fitting into like a neat narrative and really allowing the use of the language and the page itself to kind of explode our conceptions of like what it means to craft a story and what it means to write in this language. I mean, when we think about like English itself is this language of colonizers, right? And so what does it mean as a trans person to be writing a book in English about this identity that has been pushed and marginalized and pushed to the sidelines for so much of our history, especially in the West, within this like white Western colonial lens? Like, what does it mean to actually push against language itself, to push against like conceptions of the page, to push against conceptions of the self? But
No, yeah, man, I love what you're saying. I think even of transness as something that's produced through like as a colonial concept too. And often when we think about trans liberation, I always think that we need to like get beyond this kind of concept that is in a way a reaction to the, you know, racialized gender binary colonial product that was exported around the world that's forced on everyone as a form of discipline. So like even in our moments of like inhabiting transness, it's still tied up into that gender system. So I think it's interesting when, you know, you're talking about writing consciously, self-consciously in conversation with other trans writers, with other forms of trans narrative too, not just poetry, but there's like memoir and novels too, but like the possibilities of kind of breaking and changing those narratives. And it seems like right now, I don't know what you like right now, there's just a lot of exciting trans writing happening. People do trying new things out. If you want to say more just about your sort of relationship to the moment, this current moment of trans writing.
I'm so excited about all of the trans writers that are writing and being published, right? I mean, we have to think about this as within a system that has been for most of the history kind of dominated by white cis men, straight men. I think it's a real triumph even to get published, right? And so I think about the publication as one of the barriers to bringing our stories into the world. And I am excited that more presses are publishing trans writers. And also I want to acknowledge that there's still like a huge barrier to access, even to getting published for trans folks. I think that we're still working within a system that is like deeply rooted in white supremacy and misogyny and just we're living in a cis-centered world. Aside, I think that one of the things that I find so exciting about reading work by other trans people is that it inspires me and shows me what's possible. I think that one of the gifts that new forms of writing, new forms of storytelling, new stories offer us is just the possibility of, oh, you can do that. One book that was really pivotal for me was Josh Charles' poetry collection, Field, in which she's really pushing against the language itself in really, really fascinating ways. And her careful use of language and of the page really inspired me in showing me that, oh, it was possible to really break out of the confines of, let's say, even like the left-hand margin of the page, right? And even push against language itself. So I get really excited. I try to read as many trans writers as possible. They're kind of my favorite, my favorite people to read, because I think that there's real power in all of our voices going out into the world. And when I think about my book, my primary audience that I want my book to reach is other trans people. Not because my story might be relatable to every single trans person, but just to show that there are, it is possible to have these kind of expansive senses of the self and of the journey that is being a person in a body that is constantly changing.
Yeah, we consume so many narrative structures, and there's like a mainstream version of transness that's given to us by the media that right now also is like particularly virulently anti-trans, focusing like the story of the so-called detransitioners to try to like show the danger of transness and the threat it is posing to our children. The way that's the way that it's presented. That's not what I'm saying, obviously. So I think it with all the trans people who are in like writing and kind of consciously creating a body of trans literature, it seems there's been a real concerted effort to break out of the narrative for cis people to try to imagine like a cis person being able to empathize with a trans person, and but also have to like portray a trans person's experience and narrative arc as something that's kind of like sad and not to be desired in some way.
Right.
I think that that's really exciting because with all of this discussion around transness, whether it's the disgusting stuff in the media or the hateful bills and the anti-trans backlash, or even the way that people talk on the internet, like gatekeeping and weirdness within trans community itself, I think that people who might possibly want to transition can get stuck in thinking that it has to happen in particular ways, or even something I think about a lot, because like when I imagine the possibility of just having access to hormones anywhere at any time, how different transition would be. It wouldn't be this like necessarily this like one time lifetime decision. It'd be something you play with or try and relate to it in a totally different way than we do now. Yeah, the sort of the scope and varied narratives seem really important to have out there, because I do think that transness comes not simply from an experience within that's wrong, right? But also from seeing it modeled
Mhm.
in various ways as a possibility, right? And a possibility
Yeah.
that's livable and desirable. So like to have a multiplicity of kinds of narratives. And I mean, just to get personal, because I want to, like, I met you early on in your transition. I got to witness you and another dear friend transition sort of at the same time, and for me that was completely inspiring. You're the first two trans people that I knew and watched transition, basically not watched but like like was around for and like talked about it with you all, right? And that was like a model for me, right? Like that started my own sort of journey of breaking away from my life that I had been living up to that point. It took me time and to get to places, and obviously it's not over, but like that's important to have different kinds of models of possibility. Yeah, so I think that your way of doing it in this book, and also just like because I've gotten a chance to see you do readings and stuff, the way that you talk about it as you're framing it to people, I think is such a beautiful gift. I guess maybe a question from that would be like, what kind of responses have you gotten from other trans people or
Hmm.
proto trans people?
I feel really touched by the trans people who have come to me after readings, especially folks who I don't know, who express how powerful and meaningful this book has been for them in understanding their own gender, their own transitions. In my own gender journey, it was really important to me to see other trans people who were living their lives and to be able to transition with friends in community. I don't want to downplay how important it is to have community and have these kind of shared experiences and the power of being in community with other trans people. And I think also for myself, there was not only, if we're going to talk about this theme of breakup, there was not only a kind of divorce from maybe the version of myself that was supposed to be cis and this version of myself that I think my parents really wanted me to be, which was this woman. So it was not only breaking up from that story that didn't feel accurate for me, but also, I think that at first it was hard for me to come into my identity as a trans man. I didn't want to be, or I didn't see myself modeled. I don't know if I've ever articulated this before, but it's kind of interesting to think about. I knew from a pretty young age that I wanted to be a boy and that I was, or maybe that I was a boy, but I also never identified as a very masculine version of what it means to be a man. And I think it was in seeing other trans masked people who embodied versions of masculinity that were on a spectrum that enabled me to see that there was a path that I could take to become the man that I wanted to be. And so I think one of the things that I interrogated in the book and one of the things I interrogated in my own transition was it's not just that I wanted to be a man, but I wanted to be a very specific kind of man. And I think that gender is very nuanced and different for each person. For me, my gender identity was really rooted in physicality and feeling really physically dysphoric with my body pre-physical transition. And I knew that I wanted the effects of testosterone. I knew I wanted to get top surgery, but I never really identified as butch. I'm putting that in quotes. And I never really identified as really, really mass. And so I think that it was really liberating for me to meet other trans folks who were embodying versions of the type of masculinity, the type of what it means to be a man for them that then made it possible for me to see, okay, there is a place for me in this body that I have now and in the body that I want to have. And so I think that not only was transitioning, to put it more succinctly, it wasn't only divorcing myself from an idea of cis femininity or being a cis woman that I needed to kind of let go of, but also letting go of what it means to be a man and enabling, giving myself the spaciousness to find a version of maybe the word could be manness of being a man that made sense for me in my body in this particular moment, in this particular iteration of my life. And that has continued to evolve and change. I think when I first came out as trans, I did kind of lean more into a more typically like traditional mask space because I wanted so badly to be seen as a man. And then as I physically transitioned and became more comfortable in my body, that has enabled me to have more nuance and fluidity in how I present my gender and how I kind of balance between masculine and feminine, and I'm able to be truly myself.
I love how you were saying that. And it's something that I can, yeah, I see in you and also in the book in a way you address it in the book,
Yeah.
right? Like talking to this girl ghost, there's an acknowledgement of persistent feelings that predate transition, but also like a new relationship towards some of the things that you had to react against in order to transition in the first place, but that you can come to later in retrospect. But I do see this also in lots of trans people, right? Like there's like an initial feeling that you have to really embody this this opposite gender from what you were assigned at birth to
Mhm.
be trans. And then as people become more comfortable in transition or more like feeling maybe less like they have to prove it to themselves or someone else, they like play with gender more.
Yeah.
I mean, it's too simple to say that you have like butch trans girls and effeminate trans men, because I think that boxes it up again. Yeah, I mean that to me is the most exciting and interesting thing, and like the kind of people I love being around are people who are all kinds of ways in their transition that don't fit that normal structure. So it was really interesting to hear you say that, because it's something I've thought about and loved how you've modeled that and like knowing you as a person, and then was interested in how you wrote it
Mm.
too, and sharing that intimacy of thinking it through,
Mhm.
because I think that's another thing that like trans literature does, because so many of us get so stuck in these feelings and being like, no one else has these kinds of thoughts or feelings, and no one could share this. Like, this is wrong. This isn't the right way to do it. This is like, I'm not fully trans if I have these mixed desires or something like that. So
Mhm.
sharing that's like really important, I think.
Yeah, I was at a reading a couple weeks ago, and there was a cis woman at the reading who asked a question that felt more like a comment, in which she shared that she had a son who was gay, and she said, no parent would ever wish that their child would be gay or trans because it's such a hard life. And I know it must have been really hard for your parents for you to transition. And at the time of the reading, I didn't really respond. And so I don't think she's going to listen to this podcast, but I do kind of want to respond to that framing because I completely disagree. I think that parents should celebrate if they have queer or trans kids because, first of all, I think that good parenting is celebrating your child for who they are, not who you expected them to be. And also, I don't think that we should punish our children for existing in a world that the issue is not with those of us who are queer and trans. The issue is with a systemically oppressive culture that pushes us to the margins and doesn't uplift and celebrate us, but we get to celebrate ourselves. And I think that there is true joy in, I love being trans. I love being queer. I wouldn't want to be any other way at this point in my life. And yes, it has been a journey to get there, but there's nothing inherently negative or wrong about being queer or trans. I think it's parents like her that are unaccepting of their children, who really struggle with it, who actually make it much harder for their children to be themselves. And my hope, my wish for all of us is that we can really see being queer and trans as a true gift. I think that one of the benefits of being trans is having a much deeper understanding of myself, of not ever taking any aspects of my identity and my physical existence for granted, and really being intentional with the way in which I present myself within my life, with the communities, and yeah, like with the communities and people that I connect with. I think there's something really to celebrate about being trans. And I wish in that reading, in that moment, I had said this to that person. But I think that maybe I was just so shocked that I didn't know what to say in the moment. But I really want to kind of like emphasize what a powerful thing and a beautiful thing it is to be queer and trans. And it's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to wish was different. I don't think. I think that we should really celebrate ourselves and uplift ourselves and our community because we are the change that we want to see in the world. And it's only through our liberation that everyone will be free. You know, I think that we get to show cis people that it's possible to be expansive in their genders too. I think cis people are actually really constrained in certain ways that trans people, if we're lucky, we get to break out of those constraints.
Yeah, the anti-trans people like to say that, trans people are grooming kids, but I think it's Noah Zazanis writes that like cis people are the most effectively groomed, right? Like the cis kids, the kids who come out doing gender quote unquote right. I mean, yeah, that's a terrible thing to say. And the people who say that always feel like they're usually like well-meaning liberal centrists, quote unquote well-meaning, the kind who kill you with their kindness, obviously.
Yeah.
And it's like, and Jules Gill Peterson writes about this too, that like in all of these ways of talking about trans kids, and the bottom line is that there's this commonly held notion that we don't want trans kids, right? That's not a good outcome, and we should do everything we can to avoid that. And I think that that's like you said in your positive sort of vision of what transness is. Like, I mean, I think about it as a refusal to reproduce this world. And in my relationship, like thinking about relationship to youth, like the relationship of parenting, you like the biggest hope is that the violence that I underwent around gender in particular and sexuality, like isn't something that kids have to go through, and that kids have more room to refuse. Because for me, transness is a sort of a way of refusing to play that game.
Mhm.
Within the trans, within trans thinking, there's also this feeling that as transness became a sort of gelled into its identity that's like was separate from gayness, right? and
Mhm.
became its own movement for demanding certain things from the state, right? In terms of access to care and like recognition within a changed gender. That there was also a loss in the kind of expansiveness of experiencing of gender or playing with ways of being and existing, because making trans an identity involved cutting off, like kind of defining it and then cutting it away from other gay kind of subcultures. And I think that's sort of what you were getting to earlier when you were talking about your experience of like becoming the kind of man that you wanted to be, which isn't a cis man, right?
Right, yeah.
Not a cis straight man. It's another version of masculinity that's not within our common descriptions and understandings of what masculinity entails in our culture. And so that's what I think is really exciting when trans people. There's like the difference between the way trans people are like thought of and represented, and how sometimes we like represent ourselves to people who don't understand, and then like the kind of lives we live amongst ourselves. I
Mm,
mean, for me, this like experience is also that I was feeling this as you were talking, that it wasn't until, because you were saying that you need community for transition. It's something you write in the book too, that no transition happens in isolation. For me, something clicked in my life when I started hanging out with mostly trans people, and I was like, oh, oh, these are like my people. I didn't realize,
yeah.
the thing that would make me feel so suffocated in other spaces wasn't there. And
Mm,
also like there's something that I didn't have to explain. That feels liberating and removes a lot of obstacles of just like normal socializing. Not to be like a separatist or something. And I'll hang out with cis people too. Although I mean, yeah, I know I always understand when my trans friends are like saying they don't want to hang out with cis people anymore.
I think that for me, yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. I also think that for me, my experience of my gender identity, it's not that being around trans people made me trans. It's that I was already holding this identity within myself, and being around other trans people made me see that it was possible to let that out
Right.
and to be myself, and that there is power in that community. I think that for me with cis people, I just really need cis people to show me that they're trustworthy and that I can trust them to be not only allies, but real kind of advocates for trans people in terms of doing the work of making sure that there are bathrooms that we can use, and all of these different ways that cis people can show up for trans people. I think that ideally we'll be able to kind of work together to change the world for the better. But I'm often very cautious when I meet a new cis person until they can prove that they are actually not going to say something really insensitive and transphobic.
Right. And they come out with that line that this woman said to you at the
Yeah.
reading. I guess one of the ways that I thought about it for myself was like it was a process of realizing that I was allowed to. My experience of myself feels like this kind of delayed reaction or echo or something where I'm like,
Mm,
oh, why is everything I'm interested in queer? Or like, why am I only hanging out with trans people? And then being like, well, I'm not allowed to do that because like I'm not the right kind of whatever, and then feeling like, wait, hold on, I'm the only one telling myself like what I'm allowed
right.
to do. No one else is saying that to me. My trans friends had welcomed me into community without judging me, so I was the one doing all that work. I mean, actually, this is something I was thinking about in thinking about our conversation, how transition often comes with breakups in your life,
Mm,
whether they're not necessarily only romantic ones, but friendship sort of family breakups like that. I mean, the family thing is very present in your book, and you've mentioned it a few times. And I like in the book that you say like grief isn't the right framework for it, but that's the way that
mhm,
like families will often relate to being like, oh, I have to mourn my, the kid I thought I had, which is
mhm,
another feeling of a form of violence. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Like for me, like I've had to break up to be trans,
mm, Yeah, I think that transitioning, like physically transitioning, coming out as trans, gave me a real clarity on who I was. And I feel as though if folks aren't going to, people in your life, whether or not it's family or friends or lovers, if they're not going to fully embrace you as you are, as the person that you are, then that's their loss, because they're losing out on the opportunity to have a real relationship with you, not with their perception of who they think you should be or who they thought you were, but instead the opportunity there is to actually enter into a deeper sense of emotional intimacy and deep knowing. And I think it's a real gift to say, I see you for who you are, and I love you for who you are. And to let go of whatever it might say about who the person who might be negatively reacting to you coming out as trans, that's on them. That's their bullshit. That's their shit that they need to work through. And maybe they'll take the time to educate themselves and do that deep thinking and then be able to come back and be in relation with you. And maybe they won't, but I don't think that that is any judgment on you for being true to yourself. That's on them. And I think that that has been a really difficult but rewarding lesson that I've had to learn, is not to let other people's complicated reactions to my own transness affect my innermost sense of self and self-worth. Because whatever negative reaction someone else might be having, that is a product of the larger culture. I don't know if culture is the right word. Systems of oppression that they have to do their own work to move through. And maybe by moving through that, they'll be able to come back into relationship with you, and maybe not. But I think, especially with those people in my life who, for whom maybe I was like the first trans person that they know. Maybe I'm the only trans person that they know. My hope is that in knowing me and in being in relationship with me, that they will then think about the implications of their kind of political decisions, of the way in which they move through the world with perhaps a little bit more empathy for trans people everywhere. But I think that's the work that they need to do. That's not on you. And I think that especially earlier on in my transition, or like earlier on in my life as a trans person, I did a lot of labor to try to change the systems that I was in to be more trans inclusive, to try to educate folks to be more trans inclusive. And I think that that work is valuable, but I also have come into a place where I'm like, that is also a huge amount of emotional labor, and that's a gift that I'm giving them. And sometimes I need to set my own boundaries and take care of myself and let, as I was saying before, let cis people do some of that work in conjunction with trans people. But I think it's really hard when trans people always have to do all of the labor to make spaces trans inclusive, to like educate folks. And I just get really, I think that there's a tendency within this work to burn out. And I found myself not being able to fully enjoy the spaces I was in because I was layering on all of this extra labor to try to make the space inclusive. And sometimes, coming back to the theme of breakup, sometimes you have to say, actually, I'm just going to remove myself from this space because it's not meeting my needs as a trans person. That's not on me. That's on them. They did not succeed in making this a space that I could feel comfortable and welcome in. And sometimes through our removal, then that can also be a lesson for those folks. There's power in saying, actually, I won't put up with this bullshit and I'm going to leave.
Yeah, I like to think of like setting a boundary as a little mini liberation for you, but like you're saying that it's possible that that also points someone else to where they're falling short. And my experience of transition really brought into perspective for me, like the people that I didn't need to bring along with me through transition, like that I didn't want to, that I didn't want to have to explain myself to. And not because I even thought that they wouldn't get it or that they were anti-trans or something. I'm just like, oh, like I'm a I'm like in a new place, and not everyone comes with comes through that door with me, you know? And this is, I mean, this isn't specific to transness. I think it's something that we struggle with in relationships, is like so much of relationships, family, friends, lovers, the problem we run into is how we are held to be a single person, or like to held in someone's idea of who you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a moment they're like trying to pin you down, it feels like, and can't be there to witness you as complicated, as transforming all the time, as someone who's possibly like wrong and then reflects on it and realizes, or someone who changes their mind even, you know? Like so many of our relationships try to keep us in stasis at some point, like the point wherever they connected with us or something.
Right.
And yeah, for me, like just realizing like it doesn't even need to have to be like an official breakup or formal breakup or a breakup once and for all, but like breaking up with those versions, those narratives of yourself is important. I mean, family is such a big one because like families often operate through these like predetermined narratives of the role each person plays within the family system, you know, and like it's so hard to not fall into like your like parents will like make you go into that space. Even if you feel like you've done a lot of personal growth work to
Yeah.
not do it, you like be like, oh shit, I'm playing that role again that I hate. That's not actually me. It's easier for some reason to fall, maybe because they've known you like the longest or something. Yeah, I think it is. It's maybe that's something like a wisdom that transition also can like give us around relationships in this kind of thinking about breaking up is that like that experience of people changing in general. Cis people can change too.
Yeah.
It's time for a break. Welcome back to our conversation. In terms of the education stuff, that's another thing like I've grappled with because I'm a teacher and I literally take on the role in my work life to talk about gender and sexuality
Mm,
with students of all different backgrounds. And yet in my personal life, when I'm forced to do that work, I really, not always, but sometimes I'm just like, hell no, I don't want to. Or like later I'll feel like, oh, that was like harming me in this way that I didn't even understand. I've actually feeling this a lot now also as a Jewish person, feeling like I have it's incumbent on me to speak out about Gaza, but I also there's like a boundary I have with like certain kinds of Jewish Zionists who I'm like, I can't. It's like too
mhm.
horrible to like engage with them and I can't do that work right now. And I'm like really, I mean, I have a lot of admiration for the people who are willing to do that work. But yeah, it's just such a weird experience to be like, I love teaching people and yet in my life I am not there for it all the time. Figuring out when and how to set those boundaries is really can be really tough because people will put you in that position without you knowing or and you definitely didn't volunteer for it,
Yeah.
like that question that we started with, like when did you know, you know,
Hmm.
and then they want you to produce a story for them,
Right. An easy to understand story.
right, the one that makes them feel good too about themselves and
Yeah.
probably sure in their own gender, right? Because I think that's another thing that another like big blockage for people is that like the possibility of other people changing gender threatens the fact that you think you know what you are, you know, not you like quote unquote cis person being certain of a gender, right? Like
Right.
is threatened by the possibility of transition. I've
That's
had
so,
students come out in class, which is really wonderful, you know.
wow. I think that that's so interesting. I didn't think about cis. I guess I haven't really thought too much about cis people being threatened by trans people because I think I'm so often thinking about feeling threatened by cis people.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but I think that that just comes down to like fragility, right? Of white fragility, cis mask fragility. I think that if we feel really certain in who we are, then other people's identities shouldn't threaten us.
Yeah, that's why it's so cool to see you like, you know, presenting this complex narrative and a complex understanding of it. There's something that I've been wanting to get back to in the book, which is a complicated understanding of like gender relations because when you take on and I think this connects. So
Mm,
let's see if it makes sense to you. But like, you know, in taking on the Persephone myth, right? The girl ghost talks about that story of a man taking a girl, and that's really interesting to me for
mm.
you, you know, as a trans masculine person, trans man, to like talk about that, take on that part of the narrative. And but also in the moment you're saying, like you said earlier on in our discussion, that you wanted to give her a voice, which is like a lot of male writers don't give the women a voice or a good voice, or and this girl gets the last word in the book too, which is I think
Yeah.
really interesting. So I wonder if like if you had thoughts on that, just like that narrative of the man taking the girl as one understanding of transition, and also just that kind of like the gender relationships of like men getting more space, getting more voice, and even as even trans men perhaps.
Yeah, wow. Absolutely. I mean, I think that as I was thinking about the myth of Persephone, I mean, so many of these Greek myths are predicated on men raping women and abducting women. And I found the story of Persephone actually deeply disturbing. If we actually look at the myth, which is that Persephone is stolen by Hades, taken to the underworld, and then she is essentially allowed, she's rescued, she is allowed to emerge, but because she ate a pomegranate, she's eaten the food of the underworld. And so every half of the year, she has to return to the underworld. And that's why we have winter, because her mother is upset when she's gone. And I was just like, this is so, am I allowed to swear on this podcast? Okay. I was like, this is fucked up that she has to return to this land of her abductor. So that was deeply disturbing to me about the myth. And I think that I felt really complicated writing about that element of the story. And it also felt important to me to name it, that is something that's happening. To be clear, like I don't think of myself as the trans mask version of her as abducting her. I don't think that that's like the translation of the story that I was going for. I think that more I was interested in interrogating this question of what does it mean to be a survivor of sexual assault and how do we live with that history and the nuances there of like, I think that the parts of the book that talk about this, I put the lines in parentheses, so it's almost like it's being hidden within the punctuation almost. Hades isn't really like a huge figure in the book. There is a poem in which Persephone kind of talks about Hades and is in kind of conversation about how to destroy death. And I think she calls him like monster in a suit. And so in some ways I felt as though Hades was kind of a stand-in for like the worst type of perpetrator of sexual violence. And the trans mask speaker's relationship with that is, even though Persephone is in the underworld, this history of violence is still there, right? And that violence still exists, right? And that Hades, he's not a big figure, but he is there through the implication, through the myth, through the story. And so, what does it mean to have complicated histories around sexual violence and to be a man, but also to have relationship with this type of violence that is perpetrated against so many people, including women, including people of all genders.
Thank you for expanding on that. I mean, there's if it was a neat parallel, it would be that version that the New York Times likes to, platform, like the transgender craze seducing our girls, right? Like the
Right.
fear of the trans man being the abductor when it's really like cis heteropatriarchy that
Yeah.
creates the possibility of this violence. And I think your book, like in using the myth, is resisting that parallel. I mean, she says, Persephone, the ghost girl says, Persephone was just a person trapped in the amber of one greedy mistake. It's a poor parallel, the thread you've needed between her and me. Our longest grief hangs within what's unsaid. And so there's that resistance strain within the story itself. But I think
Right.
that's also like an interesting thing that when we're complicating masculinity, to bring up Noah Zazannis again, because he writes about transness in a way that I like. He wrote an essay called "On Hating Men and Becoming One Anyway," right? Sort of
Mm,
thinking about that because I mean the trans men that I hang out with tend to be ones who have like thought through the violence of masculinity, right? And are feminists, trans feminists, right? They're not trying to embody that violent masculinity that dominates our world.
right.
But yeah, I mean, I really like that you like use the myth and also resist it.
Yeah.
So, like it's useful to you in ways, maybe mostly in naming that ghost, right? And in
Mm,
giving and naming her yourself rather than taking on the name she was given, which is something that
right.
is not uttered in the book.
Yeah.
There's like a refusal to that, which I think is also powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that in many ways I'm working with the myth and also resisting it and interrogating it and queering it in many ways. It doesn't create a neat little allegory or a neat little this equals this. And I think that that can be challenging for readers, maybe. But I think that there's something inherently trans too about saying I'm not making this a neat, simple story. for you to imbibe, but instead you have to work, you have to do the work as a reader to interpret it and understand it in your own way.
I like that you're making that a specifically trans thing, because again, it's like this thing that I was trying to think about in terms of resisting the narratives that are put upon us individually in our relationships, which will hold a lot of us back and hold us in bad relationships because we play these predetermined roles. It's the narrative of transness that people perpetuate that doesn't help people transition, but reduces the possibility of transition for more people. And like, yeah, these inherited myths that we have, rather than, I don't know, like just replay them over and over again and accept the ways that they detail the world, which are ways that we want to refuse. You can play with the narrative and refuse it at the same time. Like, you can bring it
Mm-hmm.
in because it exists, right? We
Right.
can't just say pretend that these things don't exist, but refuse to follow its predetermined path. Do something different with it.
Right.
Going off that, in terms of the writing process and breaking, one thing I wanted to ask you, like the experience of writing as a form of break. I mean,
Mm.
you talk about how at some point the voice that is akin to you breaks from you, both in experience because you've lived past the writing, but
Mm.
also it becomes a different person because it's a persona, right?
Right.
And like, what's the experience of revision and like repetition of writing and going back over things?
Ooh, I love that question because I love revision. When I was revising, I did extensive revisions of this book. It first started off as a prose piece. That was just an actual letter to my former self. And I printed, it was just the first couple of pages. I printed it out and I actually cut. It initially started as kind of like a prose piece with very distinct sections. And I cut up all the sections and I lay them out on a table and I kind of put them back together in different ways. And that was a really interesting kind of like very early part of the revision process to think about resisting a linear narrative and resisting kind of like whatever comes out first being the perfect way that it should be, but instead thinking about, okay, well, this is how I wrote it, but then if I place this section by this section, that creates really interesting new nuances. And then as I continued revising it, I decided that I wanted to be breaking into the prose block and make it take up more space on the page. And my revision process is one in which I was rewriting. At certain points, I would handwrite and then type or retype from a blank draft, from a blank document. And I think that for me, it felt really important to be creating these iterative versions, each one of which was based on a former version, but that became its own document. And that way of revising allowed me to keep the writing alive and really allowed me to be really intentional with each word because I wasn't just copying and pasting, saying, okay, that poem's done. I'm going to just copy and paste that into my new document, but instead saying, okay, maybe it's done. What does it feel like to write this out again? And to see, oh, actually, when I'm typing it up this time, it feels better to break the line here, to move this here. I wrote a first draft or I wrote a ninth draft or a 10th draft and put the book in a drawer for about a year. And I think taking that distance from the work was really important for me to have the space that I needed to continue revising. And when I returned to the work, I was really struggling with getting back into it. And my therapist, actually, who I was working with specifically around publication and around writing, suggested that I try handwriting the book in a new notebook. And so I did so. I went back to pen on page and wrote, rewrote the book hand drafting. That was incredibly helpful. And through that process, I realized that there were holes, like places in the book that I wanted poems to exist that didn't exist yet. As I was doing that handwriting version, I would just write in, not trying to have it be perfect, but just say, okay, this is what I want to be here. It might even just be a description of the poem that I wanted to eventually be there. And then I typed it up again. And then I revised again. And then I revised again. And I started at a certain point, I was like, okay, I'm ready to start sharing it with folks. And I had some really trusted readers. And I'm so grateful to them. I kind of named them in the back of my book. And they all kind of read it on a different timeline. And so I'd send one version out to a friend. They would give me their thoughts. And that was always really inspiring. Like I didn't always agree with all of the revisions that they offered, but it was helpful to think about. And sometimes I was like, yeah, you're right. That would be really interesting if I revised in that direction. And I continued doing that for a while. And then at a certain point, I realized that it was done. I had told the story that I wanted to tell. I had written all of the poems that I wanted to write. I felt simultaneously very satisfied with what I had produced. And also, I knew that I could have kept working on this project forever and I could have kept writing into it, but I felt ready to start writing something new and ready to bring the book into the world. And that's when I submitted it.
I love hearing about the intimate details of the process, and also like there's the intimacy of the handwriting and rewriting. It's also to me like thinking about writing, liberating to hear if there's a way that you can hear other writers talk about their process in a liberating way. Often we hear people talking about craft as if there's a right way to do things. But even in your talking about your response to your like early readers, you were able to say like listen to them because a reader gives you an experience that they had that you can't have, but you don't have to take it on as yours, right?
Right.
You get to choose what you want to do with that information. And so I think it's really cool to like hear how other people write and think about it and be curious about it without taking it as a rule. And maybe in each project, I mean, it's like weird to like know when you're done. Like, I mean, you could write everything forever, right?
Yeah.
But there's a point where you decide, like you break with it. I also find like very in my own experience, I don't know what you feel about this, but like cutting things is like one of my favorite things to do in writing is just like just get rid of
Mhm.
something like
Oh, yeah, no, I definitely think that so I initially started writing this book as part of my MFA grad program, and Kaba Akbar was the reader for kind of my creative thesis that I submitted, which was a early version of this book. And one of the biggest pieces of feedback that he gave me was that I was saying things directly that the text already implied. And so his biggest advice was, you say, I'm going to throw out an example that's not perhaps isn't textually true, but the feeling is there. This is so sad, for example. He was like, you don't need to tell people that it's sad. It is sad. And so I think that one of the benefits of putting the book aside for a while was that it enabled me to, as they say, quote unquote, like kill your darlings, is it enabled me to go through with fresh eyes and see just how much I could cut and still keep the essence of what I wanted to say and allow the poetry to speak for itself rather than telling the reader what they should feel. And that's also one of the things I love about revising as a way of rewriting, because when I set the words to the page, I'm saying this has value and I want to keep it. And I also have those former drafts. So if I change my mind, I can always go back. There's no loss. I think that there's a sense of like, oh, if I make this change, oh no. But as long as you save your previous drafts, which I highly recommend doing, you can always, there's a freedom there too to say, I'm going to try this out. I'm going to see what it feels like to cut this part or break up the page in this way. And then if I don't like it, I can always go back to the earlier version. There's no loss. It's just an iteration. I think there's freedom there.
yeah, I really like thinking about that, the breaking and the spaces, freedom. Like just even yeah, taking that year apart. Like it's like I was thinking about how in relationships, right? People like were like, oh, we're gonna take time away from each other and come
Mhm.
back. And that's something you talk about in terms of you were talking about earlier in terms of the book, like that space away allows one to make peace sometimes with things that you've like broken with, because often it takes like a force of negative energy to break, but then you return and like, oh, that ghost can live with me. It doesn't have
Mhm.
it's not a problem anymore.
Yeah.
And relating to your writing in that way too, that you like take a bunch of space from it. I don't know, we are like compelled often to just think we have to resolve everything and figure everything out. If there's a problem, just go after it, and giving it all that, giving it space can be so helpful in terms of reflection. I don't know if I'm working the parallel too much here.
No, no, I mean, I like it. I think I agree. I also think that letting go of what it should look like and just letting it be whatever you want it to be. I think I wrote this book because I needed to write it. And to be totally honest, I never thought it would get published because I thought it was too weird, too queer, too trans, too outside. It doesn't look like like a quote unquote normal poetry collection. But I actually think that that is the book's superpower, is that I allowed it to be its own thing, and I didn't try to conform to what I thought a poetry collection should look like, and instead allowed it to be just as I wanted it to be. And that, in some ways, I think is like a parallel for being trans, is just allowing yourself to be who you are. And there's so much power in that, in being our full, authentic selves.
I've thought about that before in my own experience and my own writing and transness. I've like wrote a little essay about it. That for so long I was trying to write what I thought I should write, both in my creative writing. I like ended up writing basically like a collection of stories, which I realized in retrospect I didn't publish any of them, but I realized in retrospect they were all about masculinity and like giving it up in a way.
Mm.
But I was like trying to think about what I could also publish, and I felt so constrained by that all. And also in academia, like trying to write academic articles, like busting my head against the wall. I have so much writing that I don't even, I mean, I spent so much time on it, and I'm like, I'm not going to ever do anything with this anymore because I'm like done trying to make a thing that I don't want to make. The way that you talked about it also earlier, just like that there's so much liberation in the way that you can write all kinds of stuff. You can play with things on the page. You can do whatever you want. We burden ourselves so much with these rules and expectations, especially when your like aim is to get published and be read in a particular way. I mean, often it can make our work boring, and stop us from writing at all when we have something that we want to say. So for me, like throwing off all of those things actually like freed me to write so much more. And now I don't have the same fear that I'm not going to like please the imaginary reader who's going to reject me or whatever all the time. Because God, so much of writing and trying to publish is rejection, is being rejected. And you can really internalize that to the point of silencing yourself.
Right.
Well, it's so cool that you got this book out and it's being recognized too. You won the XJ Kennedy Poetry Prize and then recently got a Stonewall Honor.
Yeah, I'm really excited that my book was named a winner of the 2024 Stonewall Honor Book Barbara Gittings Literature Award from the American Library Association. I think I feel complicated about poetry and the po-biz, side. It's like, what does it mean to win a prize? What does it mean to receive an award? And also, I think it's really exciting to receive this sort of acknowledgement of the work. And my hope, like the reason why I'm excited about winning this award and why I feel grateful that the book won the original award, which allowed it to be published, is that hopefully that will give it a larger platform to maybe be placed in libraries and bookstores so that folks can find the book if it's meaningful to them.
Yeah, I mean, having trans literature out there is super important now because like one of the points of struggle is censorship in libraries, in particular around
Exactly.
queer books. And so identifying the books for people to read, and you want your stuff to be read. I mean, yeah, it's complicated. I think one of the things like I've noticed in having published more now is that people will relate to you differently when you're like, oh, I wrote a book, and they're like, oh, you wrote a book, like I'm gonna listen to this person. I'm like, why should you fucking listen to me over anyone else? But the opportunity that publishing has created for me is the ability to like interact with people and get feedback too about things I'm trying to work with. The problem is when someone gets published a lot and then gets all the opportunities and never really, it can close you in a way where you like don't realize that like not everyone gets to publish that way. And then also like I think that the people who open the door rather than close it behind us, which is what I think a lot of like people who professionalize as artists tend to like be trained into competition with each other and therefore like jealous of other people's successes or something. But like it's much cooler when you share all that you can with other people and help people lift their voices up, right? Like that you're
Absolutely.
one person writing a thing it doesn't have to close out the possibility of others.
Yeah, I think that gets to this idea of false sense of
Scarcity.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I get to this idea of a false sense of scarcity when in fact I think that it's so important to lift up all of our voices. It also, in a weird way, it reminds me of before I started my physical transition, but after I came out as trans, it was really hard for me to be seen as a man in the world because of the way in which people make assumptions around gender. I felt like I was constantly having to tell people my pronouns are he and him, I am a man. And then after I physically transitioned, people, I'm lucky in my physical transition that I think that I now present in a way that folks see me for the gender that I have, which was very validating, but also really problematic because I was the same person before I started my physical transition, right? And some trans folks never want to physically transition or don't have the resources to do so. And it's like your identity is just as valid whether or not you physically transition or not, right? And I feel kind of the same way about the poetry, where I was always a poet. I was always writing, getting the book published, winning these awards. It's lovely and really validating, and that folks are now seeing me as a poet and taking me seriously as a poet. But I was a poet before I won these awards or got the book published. And I'm going to continue writing in the way that I did before because it's important to me, not because of some sense of external validation. And I think that this comes back to the sense of, I also teach yoga, this concept within yoga philosophy that we are whole just as we are. And our sense of self is founded in who we are, not on external validation, not on those around us. And all of that is just kind of like distractions from our internal sense of self. And I think true liberation is allowing ourselves to let go of these external validations and find a sense of peace from within. Because if we're always counting on other people to validate us, either through giving us awards, publishing our books, seeing us as the genders that we are, sometimes that might work out well, but life is a roller coaster. Life is going where it is, the thousand sorrows and a thousand joys. It's not always going to be being seen and validated. Sometimes we're not. And if we're constantly allowing all of these external forces to affect us, then we're never going to find peace. And I think that this is the problem with capitalism too, right? Is that it's this structuring of our society and our world that tells us we have to constantly strive for that better something. And instead, I think that true peace comes from within.
Yeah, I love the parallel of transition and like publishing. That's really interesting to think about. I hadn't really thought about that before, and that form of recognition and like connecting that gender and capitalism. So there's a point in thinking about transness that gender becomes fucking ridiculous, and you also have that in the book too, because you have the like gender diagram sections
Yeah.
that repeat gender so much to the point of absurdity, and they
Yeah.
have humor in it, like because the book isn't one tone of like grief. It has like humor in it too, and I think probably a lot of trans people get to that place where it's like, oh my god, I mean, like thinking about this shit forever, and it's like it's so ridiculous. What you just said helped me articulate one of the reasons why I think about gender abolition, and that trans liberation has to have a horizon of abolition, because gender is transactional in our culture,
Mm-hmm.
like on this capitalist way, because gender happens in those moments of validation recognition. It's like someone sees you in a way and like acknowledges your gender, and then that's like, I think Mackenzie Wark and wrote about it, and Hill Malatino quotes her too, just like thinking about gender as this like transaction, this gift, a moment of exchange. And if we think about it that way, then we can maybe, that gender is this thing that happens between us, whether it's through violence and discipline or recognition, right? In good moments. Those aren't predictable, and you can't depend on them, like you're saying, and not everyone gets them. And so yeah, when we're relating to transness in a way that's like seeking forever to be safe and known or validated in our gender, I think that ends up playing into this kind of this like the neoliberal identity politics, the capitalist form of thinking that gender itself could be liberatory, and that's not it, right? That's not
Right.
the world that I'm, at least for me, and it's not where I'm trying to go, where like I can be safe and secure in one way that is like mirrored back to me, and that makes me feel fully known and seen. Like I don't know, that's not, I mean, that takes it out of the kind of political realm the way I just phrased it. But yeah, that was just really helpful to me to think about. So I was trying to work out some of the ways that it makes me think about the abolition of gender,
Mm-hmm.
transness, not into being known, but into an unknown, basically.
Yeah, and I think that it comes also, to me, it kind of speaks to this question of, or is our experience of our bodies a purely social function? Or do we have an internal identity with the self? I would argue for myself that, as I shared earlier, I felt deeply physically dysphoric. And so for me, physical transition was really important for me to feel at home in my body. And I did feel very affirming to physically transition and be seen by others and to have that gender reflected back to me. But the experience of my gender started within me. For me, this isn't true for all trans people, but for me, started within my physical sense of myself and my body. And I also know that for other trans people, they have different experiences. Someone might choose to physically transition because they want to be seen in the world in a certain way, but maybe they don't feel as dysphoric as I did, right? And so there's nuances there too. But I always kind of think about this push and pull between an internal sense of the self and an external experience of gender. And I think one of the things that I've seen since the pandemic is I feel like a lot of this is not an empirical evidence-based thing. This is just my own observation of reality. Is I feel like a lot of trans people came out through the pandemic. And I feel like partly maybe that was because for those of us who are socially isolating, we didn't have to go out into the world and perform gender in the same way. And so being at home and in the privacy of our homes, we were able to, some trans folks were probably able to connect with their own identity in a new way without the external forces and pressure of society. So I don't really know what I'm getting at here, but I think that there's, something really interesting there.
No, I think you're making a good point because I wasn't trying to say there's nothing internal to transness, but I'm thinking about that it's never assured, no matter how you transition in terms of surgeries and medication, which also, as you said, people don't have reliable access all the time,
right,
financially and through insurance, to either of those things. It's never assured that you will be received in a certain way, but there's obviously a thing that drives people to transition, which is not simply that seeking that recognition, but something that doesn't fit, right? That's so I think it's important that you brought that up. And I was actually thinking too about that pandemic phenomenon, that especially during the moments where more people were isolating and locked down, that it was really enabling for people to transition, and I really do think that is because that, like you said, they didn't have to worry about how they would be received. I also think that there's I've heard some trans people talk about the experience of isolating and lockdown as a relief from having to worry about that, right?
right,
the worry of how you're going to be seen on the street, which can be a violent
right,
reaction, or just the work, because gender is labor too. Gender is work that you do for society and yourself, and so there's a relief from that. And even the mundane things like the bathroom, right?
right.
The fear of using a public bathroom is something that all trans people experience in one way or another. There was also just the relief, I think, of being and so that can sort of alter your perception of gender, where it's the way the world demands you to do it versus the way that you do it when you're free from that.
Yeah, for myself, I learned that I really enjoy wearing comfy clothing.
Yeah. Okay, well, we talked for a long time. Maybe one last question I can ask you as a way to round it out. Just a thing that's behind the way I'm thinking about the breakup theory is what breakup wisdom do you have, or what way has a breakup been liberating to you?
I think my piece of breakup wisdom is that I think that sometimes when we are the person enacting the breakup, right, breaking up with someone, whether it's a sexual relationship or a friendship, is that we can try to soften the blow because we want to care for the other person's feelings, and so we can tend to maybe not be as direct as a way of trying to soften it. But I think just being honest about your own experience is actually in some ways a way of showing respect to the other person, and letting them have their own experience and not trying to care for them in the process of breaking up with them, if that makes sense. Because I think that sometimes when there can be, that can lead to a lack of clarity, right? Of, are you actually breaking up with me? Or are you, if you try to let them down so gently that they don't even realize that they're being broken up with because you're being so nice about it, And just being really clear with yourself of why you're breaking up with this person or this situation. It's harder to do than to say. I think that's definitely true too.
We like get stuck in caring for people, and sometimes I think what I'm hearing you say is that sometimes the thing that we think is care and even may look like typical care can be harmful.
Yes.
Because we're not being honest, and like the caring thing would be to be honest and let a person be able to care for themselves in that moment too.
Right. Yeah, I just think that from my own waspy culture, I think there's a lack of directness in communication that can actually be harmful. And so being direct in communicating your needs, maybe this isn't even just for a breakup, but just in relationships in general, being really direct with communicating your needs and allowing the other person to receive that rather than assuming what that person's needs are and what they need to hear, but instead just owning what you need and communicating that directly and clearly is a gift and can actually be a way of showing care and respect to the other person.
I mean, that in a way sounds to me like getting back to the kind of like narrative thing of like getting sort of taking your projections off a person too, but also, yeah, relieving people from the work that we do to like care for each other is a gift, right? It's maybe a negative gift because it's like it's not seen, you're not like giving a thing, it's like giving a space.
Right. Yeah. And for myself, I think that in my life, I've stayed in relationships or stayed in jobs, stayed in situations that are no longer serving me for longer than perhaps were wise because I was afraid. I was afraid of what would happen if I ended that relationship, that experience of employment. The unknown of what would come after was scary. And also, I think one of the great lessons of my life has been learning to trust myself, to know when my boundaries are being crossed, when a situation is no longer positive, supporting, uplifting, but instead depleting, and making the call to say, I'm going to leave this situation out of a way of caring for myself. And I haven't always known what's going to come next, but I don't regret any of those decisions to leave. And I feel as though my life is much more full, joyful now than it would have been if I'd stayed in those negative situations.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, break up with everything. Break up with your gender, break up with your job, break up with your boyfriend, whatever, you know. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Sebastian, for talking with me and sharing all these insights and experiences and wisdom. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shuli.
You can find Sebastian at his website, www.sebastianmerrill.com, where there's also a way to buy his book directly from him, which he says is the best way to do it. And you can also find him on Instagram at seb.merrill. Thank you for listening to The Breakup Theory. If you want to stay plugged in or support us, you can go to patreon.com/thebreakuptheory. Also follow us on your podcasting app and give us a rating if you like. See you next time.